Let's go now to the tool itself. Tell us, what is a metabolic cart?
So it goes by the name of indirect calorimetry. And it's been used in research for a while. So if you look at any obesity papers and also in athletes, it has been used for a long time. However, it's due to expense and calibration needs, which you mentioned before, it's not been used in the clinic that much. And that's what myself and obviously Metabolic Health Solutions are passionate about. Let's bring this technology, which gives such key data, to those that need it most. And I'm biased, I don't think it's the elite athletes or the lucky 10 people that get to go on an obesity research. So it has those two sensors we mentioned before, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide sensor. So we're measuring in the atmosphere, there's 21% oxygen, and we measure what you're breathing out, as well as those waste products. So that's how we get the information we're getting from. It's about a 5 to 10 minute breathing test with the cart that we use, using specialized sensors that are designed to be nice and stable over time, maybe forgoing some of the issues that we see in research or you mentioned before. But yeah, there's different types. So in a hospital setting, for example, they might use a ventilated hood to get the requirements for someone who can't talk for themselves, to make sure they're not underfeeding them, which can have severe complications when you're trying to recover from something. We use a mouthpiece for ours in terms of ease of use, a little bit claustrophobic for most patients. And generally people find it can feel a little bit weird, but generally people find the test quite non-invasive and easy to do, which means the power can be that it can be reassessed regularly. So some of these changes can occur within 3 to 5 days. So bringing some really powerful data and feedback to the patient.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Now, we had two different versions of the test that we were running. One was a resting version, and one we called the active metabolic assessment, which is more like what people would just associate with like a VO2 max kind of a test.
Yeah.
And more people would want to do the active version because it looked sexier. That's what I see on the Gatorade commercial, and it looks fun. I want to see my performance, and that's great. We use that to help people get really, really good results. But I always made the argument that, you know what, the resting test is not as sexy. It doesn't look as cool, but you're going to get more information out of that test than you will on the other test. What do you think? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and as I said, there is value, particularly maybe for athletes in training zones and those sorts of things, the higher end, but particularly with the populations I deal with, is when we have a look at the breakdown of what contributes to metabolism and our energy expenditure, 70 to 80%, particularly in the sedentary populations, is our resting metabolism. So that's going to have the biggest bang for its buck when it particularly comes to chronic disease management, the sleep, the fatigue, the recovery, all those things we mentioned before, even in athletes, but it's not to say that it can't be used in conjunction. That's just been my personal experience.
Yeah, no, that's great. You mentioned earlier that this test is often used in studies and things like that. And I think most people would remember the study that came out in 2016 with the Biggest Loser contestants. And they actually did the test, and they did the test 6 years after the contest was done. These people, on average, everybody knows they regained weight. They regained most of their weight on average, and their metabolic rate never really recovered from that. And that study was done using these same metabolic carts. And so when you're saying it's actually used in big studies, it actually is. And it's really interesting to validate what's going on when somebody is losing weight the correct way versus somebody that's losing weight in a way that they're going to rebound.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that data helps to explain some of the physiology as to why. And so when we understand that, we can put things in place. So in the clinic, one of the things I'm looking at is making sure their metabolic rate isn't declining. I'm not waiting 6 years later after they've regained all that weight to find out, as well as maintaining their muscle mass is also really key there. Yeah. And on that note, just interjecting is, now, for example, we see a lot of bariatric surgery, particularly here in Australia. So they use this technology, and one of the researchers looking at those who got the best results from bariatric surgery and those that regained. And what they found is those that didn't have metabolic flexibility, were poor fat burners at rest, actually got poorer outcomes. So this can teach us a lot, once again, is if we get people right before they go for surgery, whether it's something like bariatric surgery or even knee surgery, if they've got less inflammation, more metabolically flexible, they're going to recover better and get better outcomes. So I found that really interesting, that this technology, as I said, has been used in research with the changing times and changing methods, and can provide a lot of insight to what's going on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I observe that like when people go and get these surgeries, like you're not excused from the work. You still have metabolic work that you need to do. And yeah, you should get the surgery if you've done that work. But if you haven't, you're going to go back to where you were and you might cause some severe metabolic damage. So I love that you made that point. You said something earlier I want to circle back to. You mentioned that our resting metabolic rate, or the number that you're measuring for our metabolism, is only a certain percentage of our calories. It is a majority of the calories that we burn in a day. Why is it a majority of the calories? I think most people think, well, the majority of the calories that I burn is when I go to the gym for an hour every single day and run on a treadmill. And that is not even close to being accurate. Can you tell us why our resting metabolic rate is the greater percentage of the calories we burn, and where the other calories burn, rather calorie burns come from, but why they may not add up as much as people think?
Yeah, really great question. So that resting metabolism, our energy goes to all the things that we do to keep us alive. So everything from breathing, the cell making energy, as well as the brain using fuel, all those sorts of things that we do unconsciously. Then the other contributing factors is, as we say, exercise, and also we take a small amount of, generally about 10%, to break down the food in the gut. Does require some energy. So all that being said, is often why we have patients who are really motivated, slogging it out in the gym, and sometimes not getting the results they desire, not due to lack of work. And it's because they might be, burning calories in the gym, but even at rest, they're burning glucose instead of fat. And they go to a high intensity workout, they're going to burn more glucose. So what that might look like is they might be fatigued, they might be hungry after a workout, and their physiology has a response saying, let's eat more. And as I said, that's why, unfortunately, if the equations are accurate, is they might not be burning as much as they expected, because the mainstay is they're resting, and also there is some compensatory mechanisms afterwards because of their physiology, depending on what they're burning
Yeah.
as well. Have I missed out any key elements there?
No, that's fantastic. I mean, thinking about that person who's doing, like you said, no lack of work in the gym. They are working very, very hard. They look like a puddle of sweat in the gym. They're running on the treadmill and they're mouth breathing at a very high heart rate. And they want, why can't I lose weight? Why am I still retaining visceral fat? Why do I feel cold in my extremities? Why am I experiencing sugar cravings? And why does my weight loss seem to completely plateau 5 or 6 weeks after I start this new program trying to lose weight? Like, it happens every time, and that's when the weight gain starts again. So yeah, that was perfectly explained. We're talking here about resting metabolic rate. Some people might hear that and say, well, I know about basal metabolic rate. Can you explain the difference between the two, and why, they're very similar, but for practical reasons we choose to really focus on resting metabolic rate?
Yeah, so basal metabolic rate is essentially after a 12-hour rest. So you're in a complete state of doing nothing, which, as I said, might be the most accurate as to what the body does in that state. But when we think about our daily lives, that's not how we spend most of it. And also, in terms of testing, it's not very practical to get people to do so. So what specifically the protocol we use, a 4-hour fast, end of a meal cycle. So all the insulin should be cleared, everyone should be burning fat, as well as no exercise the morning before as well. They should be in a relatively resting state. Should be about 10% within that basal metabolic rate, and most importantly, repeatable over time so we can assess the change.
Yeah, I know you use electrical impedance to measure body fat as well. And it's the same thing. You want to keep the conditions exactly the same as best you can every time, so that you've got a good baseline. So, okay, that's really well explained. When somebody uses a bioelectrical impedance machine, for example, they might see a readout that shows their resting metabolic rate or their basal metabolic rate. And they might look at that number and say, okay, well, all I had to do was stand on the scale. This gave me everything I need. Why do I need to go see Kirsty? Can you explain what the difference is between indirect calorimetry, like you mentioned, and what is popping up on a body fat scale?
Absolutely. Now, what that is so even taking a step back is you can have a look at your metabolic rate or predict your metabolic rate by looking at your age, height, and gender. There are some formulas out there. There's a study that was done a while ago by Foster, and he had a look at middle-aged females. They should have all had about the same metabolic rate according to these equations. They varied dramatically by 30% over, 30% under. So if you're overfeeding someone by 30%, they're not going to lose weight. If you're underfeeding them, they're going to be tired, hungry, and not really stick to it. So once again, this is one of the fall downs of the equations, similar to BMI. Great for populations at an individual level, can be very misleading, and it doesn't tell you anything about fat burning either. Now, with the bioelectrical impedance, what that does is add muscle mass and fat mass to that equation, depending on what you're using. So it adds in another factor, which might be a little bit more accurate, but it cannot take into account genetics, hormones, medication, lifestyle, all those other things which have a huge impact on metabolism. So that brings us to indirect calorimetry. What we're looking at is, as I said, the gold standard, what's happening in the body as a whole.
Yeah.
So particularly for the populations that we deal with that aren't going to be the norm, that's why it's necessary.
Yeah, I love that. No, we would, on our reports, we would show that, according to, I think it was the Harris-Benedict formula based on age, height,
Yeah.
weight, and gender, it might be this average. This is the average for your, demographic. Your age, height, weight, and gender should be somewhere in here. I do agree that bioelectrical impedance scales do a better job because they assume based on your muscle mass, which should be a little bit more metabolically active, that might give you a better number and at least get you thinking about resting metabolic rate. And I appreciate that. But yeah, we saw wide variances in metabolic rates when we were measuring. It was way more valuable to actually conduct the test. And yeah, like I was used to using the example of saying, like, what if we took the average pant size of everybody in America and gave everybody that size pants? Like, that would be the average, but it would probably not fit very many people. It might only fit like 10% of people because it is only an average.
Exactly. I think that's really good. And it's important to note when they came up with these metabolic equations, they used specific populations. It was generally Caucasian populations who were at university. So you can see how they might skew the results as well.
Yeah, okay. And again, I do find some value in knowing what the equation is because it gives me at least a ballpark of where I think somebody's metabolic rate should be. So somebody who is healthy metabolically, what things would you expect to see as far as their results after they complete their test?
In terms of the metabolism test?
Yeah, in terms of what are you expecting on the readout to be able to tell somebody like somebody burning lots of calories or not very many calories, or is somebody really metabolically healthy burning both fats and carbohydrates, a majority of one? Like, what would you expect to see and be able to talk to that person about after the test? Somebody who is metabolically healthy.
Yeah, great question. So what I would generally expect, and I personally focus on the fat and carbohydrates first, because that can dictate how efficient they are, how much fuel they're burning, and those sorts of things as well. So what it means by being metabolically healthy is that ability to switch between the two. So at rest, I'd be burning about 80% fat, 20% glucose. Their metabolic rate, as I said, would generally be within expected limits. Sometimes maybe a little bit high. If it's too extreme, maybe, we might want to have a look at things like hyperthyroid, stress and those sorts of things. And then if it's too low, that's hypothyroidism, or maybe they're very efficient. It's actually really interesting. Not myself personally, but some people have had a look at particularly aerobic athletes, and the way the oxygen flows into the cells is great. So like that car analogy, they're not burning a lot of fuel. So the metabolic rate might be perceived as low, but it's not a bad thing, because when we have a look at their efficiency, it's actually really good. So they're the sorts of things I might look at and see for the patient. And sometimes it's really good to see that you're on the right track. But what's also really interesting is judging a book by its cover. Sometimes we see these fit people, even athletes, and they look really fit and healthy, and we test them, and it might not be the case. So when we delve deeper based on this information, we talk about their sleep, their recovery, their iron status, their carbohydrate loading. And because they're doing all this exercise and they look fit, they assume they can get away with a lot. So one example, I've had a triathlete with fatty liver, not burning
Wow.
fat. So once again, is on the flip side is you can also have someone who's really overweight, but might not have those diabetes and high blood pressure and all those things associated. And they can actually also be metabolically healthy. Does reduce the risk, but obviously the extra weight does put burden on their joints and everything else. So something else to consider, but once again, what metabolically healthy could look like.